Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our event, Realignment of the Right Post-EU Elections. We will be reflecting on European politics, especially the European parliamentary elections, from a transatlantic lens. We have with us Jan Zahradil from the Czech Republic. He's a member of the European Parliament for the Civic Democratic Party, and he's the former president of the European Conservatives and Reformist Party, which is currently led by Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy. And we'll be listening to his words on the current state of conservatism and the right in Europe. We have a number of philosophical and ideological and conceptual questions. The right seems to be doing very well, in the polls at least, and electorally populists have won various elections in Europe, including in my own country. By the way, I'm Erik Hendricks, a sociologist, visiting fellow at the Danube Institute. And I should say, because it's a little bit confusing, I'm not on there, I'm standing in for István Kiss. István Kiss is our director of the Danube Institute, is regretfully ill today, so I'm replacing him. And in my own country, the Netherlands, the elections were just won by Geert Wilders of the PVV. He ran on an anti-migration platform. So like the situation in the Netherlands and in many other countries, the right is doing very well, but is it a conservative right? Maybe not. Maybe it's just the populist right running on a migration platform. Can we resynthesize, bring back together populist sentiments and conservatism? What kind of movements do we have on the right currently in Europe, and what are their electoral prospects and their prospects for working together? Now, I will give the floor first to Mr. Zahradil. Mr. Zahradil, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for being here. And thank you, by the way, for mentioning the fact that I have also served as a president, or the first ever president, of the ECR party, the European Conservatives and Reformist Party, being directly replaced by the current Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, because it gives a good evidence that once being the president of the ECR party, you can become the prime minister. And because I haven't been the prime minister yet, I hope that one day it might come. We will see. But anyway, before I will start to talk about European right, or what exactly does that mean today, I will try to define it, as has been said, via transatlantic lens, because the definition of our position, or political parties' position towards particularly transatlantic relations and United States is one very defining moment for whether you can be considered center-right, or maybe far-right, I don't know. It's also a label which is being widely used, or rather misused, in contemporary political debate. But it's here. I will try to frame this introduction by two very recent visits that happened not a very long time ago. 2 weeks ago, we had in Prague, in my hometown, we had Bill Clinton. And at the same time, or almost the same time, the weekend before, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban paid a visit to Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And I think that those two visits symbolically represent how and where the transatlantic relations shifted, and what could be the position of contemporary European right or center-right towards what's going on across the ocean as one of their defining moments. Well, Clinton in Prague, that was nostalgia. That was, sweet remembering about late 90s, about Clinton in White House and Václav Havel in the Prague Castle, and Madeleine Albright, by the way, of Czech origin, running the State Department, and first NATO enlargement. And at that time, world was unipolar. United States dominated. China was nothing. Russia was on its knees. And we lived in a decade of historical optimism, of the end of history by Fukuyama, and of inevitable and universal democratic future of a Western style. That world is over. World is not unipolar, but neither it is bipolar, it's multipolar. Geopolitical balance is shifting. Balance of power is changing. New spheres of influence are being defined. Russia again making unrest in Eastern Europe. China became in the meantime the world superpower. India is catching, almost there, not yet, but definitely is preparing to go for that position as well. Global South is emancipating, and democracy, according our standards, is not prevailing in the world globally. And probably one of the most profound shifts or changes is that United States are different than they used to be 25 years ago. First, we had a very strong wave of woke liberalism, of progressive social theories that penetrated media, academia, intellectual background, and everything, and somehow radicalized particularly the left wing of Democratic Party. And then as a response, we also had a shift on the right wing in the GOP, in Republican Party, shift in the direction of national conservatism, which is, by the way, the stream that is strengthening in recent years in Europe as well. And I think we will touch this later on, a little bit later. But the US version of national conservatism plays even more important role in our Euro-Atlantic civilizational circle as well. And that US national conservative style is very different from former Reagan-Bush doctrine built on freedom, concept of freedom, economic globalization, free trade, free market, export of democracy and human rights, and so on and so on. National conservatives, they revitalize, first of all, the concept of nation state, of national sovereignty and national interests. And they are highly skeptical about the whole ecosystem of global institutions, of multinational corporations, of intertwined NGOs, which they suspect from being deeply contaminated by left-wing progressivism. For the same reasons, sometimes national conservatives look a bit suspiciously also to a concept of free market and free trade, because they believe that the rules of the game, the rules of that playing field, is also being mostly defined by contemporary liberal elites. And that's the reason why sometimes we even see from some national conservative governments that they are not shy from embracing some slightly protectionist measures or even pursuing them themselves. But first and foremost, that shift on the US side was very important for changing long-term principles of US foreign policy, which for many decades was built on some kind of mainstream consensus characterized by idealism, internationalism, interventionism, and that consensus is being gradually abandoned by national conservatives. They are, in foreign policy, much more reluctant, much more restrictive, much less willing to engage directly abroad, sometimes even touching slightly, they are not there yet, but touching a little bit the principles of isolationism, which, by the way, is a very legitimate doctrine, or one of very legitimate doctrines of US foreign policy. Only we perhaps forgot about that in a long post-war decades, and particularly after the fall of communism in 1989. And I think that Donald Trump is not the reason for all those changes, but on the contrary, is a result of those changes. And if not him, then someone else would come with the same or very similar ideas. And unfortunately, both our liberal and conservative Atlanticists, somehow still stuck in those sweet memories about late 90s, they didn't neither understood nor accepted those changes. And I think that my government, the current Czech government, and perhaps even the new Polish government are the very good example of that. Those changes, however, have been very well understood, particularly by Prime Minister Orban, who, in my feeling, became a leading personality in promoting national conservatism in Europe. And he very skillfully built communication channels to US Republicans via CPAC, via cooperation with the Heritage Foundation and others, and he skillfully abandoned that cordon sanitaire which was built around him by both European and US establishment. And the reason is that Viktor Orban today is the one who is briefing Donald Trump about Europe, and not Macron or Donald Tusk or someone like that. Because those representations, usually they do not talk with Orban, they despise Trump, and they believe that Trump is some kind of deviation that should be put into order after next US elections, and so on and so on. This is very short-sighted, and this is only about the past and not about the future. I think that this understanding of changes in US political landscape is necessary to understand, for better understanding what exactly today is the European right or right wing, or however we can call that. As you know, to simplify things, we have three political groupings in the European Parliament that could be considered right wing. One is the traditional EPP, European People's Party, which is mostly dominated by Germans, by the CDU-CSU. Then you have relatively new force or new kid on the block, the ECR, my party, that has been launched only in 2009 with a great help of then British Conservatives, but they left in the meantime after the referendum in 2016, so they are not anymore there. And they were somehow replaced by a dominant force of the ECR by the current ruling Italian political party, the Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, run by my successor as the ECR party president and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, which shifted the ECR more to a national conservative principles. And then, of course, you have probably the most extreme expression of those tendencies, and this is the ID group, also relatively new in the European Parliament, dominated by French and by the National Front of Marine Le Pen. Now the question is whether those three political families can somehow cooperate and can somehow find a common ground after current European elections, whether they can find some lowest common denominator which would allow them to change at least the atmosphere, if not the general course in the European Parliament, and to influence, for instance, the composition of the European Commission and also of its agenda. I have to say that I am relatively skeptical to that outcome, because there are still some divisions amongst those three groups that, in my feeling, would prevent them from maintaining some deeper cooperation. However, doesn't exclude the possibility of some case-by-case cooperation on some particular agendas. And most particularly, I think, we will see that change in much more reluctance towards all ambitious Green Deal goals during the next tenure of the European Parliament. One evidence of that has been already a very, I would say, significant change or significant shift or delay concerning the car industry, which is the legal act called Euro 7. That was significantly diluted in comparison with its original version. The problem is, and I'm going back to my transatlantic introduction, that each of those political groups are perceiving future of transatlantic relations a bit more differently. The EPP is more focused on traditional mainstream transatlanticism, which has been represented by mainstream of both Democrats and Republicans, and which, in my feeling, is gradually disappearing. ECR is somehow in between. You have more enthusiastic political parties vis-à-vis mainstream. You have also other political parties that are more able, in my feeling, to understand the reality of the present and of the future, closer to the position of the Prime Minister of Hungary. And then you have ID, which probably is even better to understand that, but they have one big burden on their shoulders, and this is that they are getting, when it comes to economy, they are getting far more protectionist and far more isolationist than it would fit to the European competitiveness and European prosperity, which I also do not consider to be very healthy. I think, at the end, I think, will be able to realign ourselves on some particular well-defined agendas in the next European Parliament. We will be able to change the atmosphere, but not the course. We will be able, particularly in the field of economy, to establish more business-friendly, more entrepreneur-friendly legal framework. But I don't think that in general issues of, let's say, foreign policy or defense and security, there will be some profound change. And maybe that would be only triggered by one of the outcomes of US presidential elections on the 6th of November this year, in the case that the stream represented by national conservatism will win in US and will trigger some unstoppable changes in transatlantic relations, to which European right and those three streams I have mentioned here will have to react somehow. By the way, interesting thing that those changes might be expected is a sudden activity, and probably you have noted that as well, of French President Macron, who belongs to the liberal family in the European Parliament and on the European political scene. And I think that Macron is smart enough to understand that there will be some change in US engagement vis-à-vis Europe. And he feels very well that it might bring some new power opportunities for his own country, which I think was very well expressed in his suddenly hardline rhetorics vis-à-vis Russia, and even some expressions that under some circumstances he will be willing to participate directly in the war in Ukraine. I think that we must not forget at the same time that he's a French politician, and he, of course, pursues particularly French interests, and French interests are that are skillfully masked as European ones, and French interests are traditionally strategic autonomy, which is in fact contrary to transatlanticism, which is independent European military and defense capacities. Again, it's a slight dilution of NATO, and also removal of the national veto right in the Council of the EU, which definitely means weakening of states like the Czech Republic, Hungary, and others. And I think that we have to understand that he's de facto acting rationally, because he's only preparing to fill the space about which he thinks will be made empty in a very short time. So at the end, I believe that we on the European right or center-right, we should admit to ourselves that this old idea of transatlanticism from late 90s, which in some countries was a long-term axis of its foreign policy, particularly in my case, in the Czech Republic, definitely it was like that, is slightly going away step by step. And that is time for its recalibration, and maybe also for preparation of some other scenarios of some plan B and C. If we don't do that, we might be surprised, and probably not positively surprised, even very soon after the US presidential elections this November. And if we will be able to do that, if we will be able to reflect the changes, that a renewed or recalibrated idea of transatlantic relations could also help ourselves to redefine ourselves and find a better common ground for our future realignment. I think it would be a very good starting point. That's where I would probably stop for the beginning, and I'd be happy for any reactions from my fellow speakers and then from any remarks or questions from your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zahradil. You have offered us a magnificent topography of the right side of the European spectrum, and clearly laid out some of the division lines and the upcoming challenges. Now, to our transatlantic topic here, you mentioned that you believe that the upcoming elections in the United States will be a determining factor for the political scene in Europe. And in that light, we're going to have 3 responses by 3 of our Danube Institute visiting fellows, each of which is coming to us from the Anglosphere. Lana Starkey is from Australia, and Nathan Levine and Carlos Roa are from the United States, and they will respond to your comments from a transatlantic perspective, in light of the fact that European politics still has this very strong America orientation, and that what happens in the who takes the White House, and especially with the upcoming election, may have profound ideological effects in Europe. So to that, I'd first turn to, I believe that Nathan Levine, you are the first on our list.
Well, thank you for some very interesting remarks. I think what most strikes me is that you mentioned some of these fissures and divides on foreign policy among the right, both across the Atlantic but also within Europe. What it seems to me is that there is a great deal more alignment on issues that precedes that, which might help overcome some of those differences. What I mean is, what it strikes me that all of the energy that we're seeing on the right, both in Europe and in the United States today, has a very similar character. And you might call that populist, but what I'd characterize it as is this deep public dissatisfaction with a number of things, but the most important being the sort of feeling among the populace of all of these different countries that their destinies are being controlled by this technocratic managerial elite, which is totally unaccountable to democracy, to the public vote. So when they vote for various candidates who promise them things, such as a lower rate of immigration, that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because the bureaucratic apparatus of both each of these nations and the EU is so vast, and the limitations of the courts and so on is very dense. So these publics come to feel that they don't have a legitimate way to change policy, and that the elite in each of these countries is totally out of touch or simply doesn't care about their problems. And so we see that all over the place, and I think that's sort of the energy behind, say, the populist farmers' revolts that we've seen in numerous countries, that there is this top-down imposition that is totally out of touch, imposing various policies on them. And I think that applies to the question of foreign policy in the sense that these countries, each being very different and having their own conditions, but the public, I think, in so many countries, including in the United States, has come to feel that foreign policy is an area in which they have no say whatsoever, much like migration. And so that they feel that no matter who they vote for, whatever party it may be, that party will lead them into a war they don't want, or lead them into international trade treaties that they don't want. And so what we see is that conservative parties, if we can call them that, the parties of the right, in responding to this populist energy, sort of have no choice but to adapt themselves to a situation in which the people themselves have more say over foreign policy. And what that looks like is, in a raw form, the sort of more isolationist tendencies, but I think could be sort of satisfied by a more democratic spirit, possibly in alliance with other nations. But what the public really does not want is the idea that their destinies, including of war and peace, will be determined by international bodies, or international groupings without their consent. So I think that's really the issue here, and what we're going to see more and more often in the years ahead.
No, that's it. I think that to say that there's a democratic deficit in the European Union and that a lot of policies are de facto imposed from above without any control is an old story. And the mechanism or the institutional architecture of the European Union, unfortunately, is constructed in a way that allows that to happen. European Parliament considers himself to be the highest elected representative body of all European citizens, which of course is far from truth, because we admit that it's directly elected. But on the other hand, if you look at the turnout in low turnout in various European countries, which per se is delegitimizing the credit of those who are elected. That's point number one. And point number two is also a discrepancy between various individual countries in their national strength. So you can easily find out the situation, particularly in the European Parliament, that the mainstream cartel of two strongest political groups, which is the EPP on one hand, Socialist on the other hand, are de facto running the show for decades. Now they, since 2014, I think, and definitely 2019, and even more in 2024, they will be losing that ability to create a simple majority just themselves. So they will need a third partner to make it. The big question mark, who might be that? I think that if we just count the numbers, then theoretically there might be a majority of so-called center-right forces. The EPP, ECR, and ID plus some independents might represent a majority, but they will not do that because there will be, some natural barriers for them to cooperate on a more systemic way, which I already tried to identify. The thing is that European Parliament also is not ideologically neutral. It's a most pro-integrationist, most pro-federalist body, which usually argues that in order to remove the democratic deficit of European Union, it is necessary to continue on a pathway to a full federal structure of Europe, including a full-fledged government, including the parliament with legislative powers, which European Parliament is still trying to achieve, and with more majority voting in the Council of the EU, particularly in the area of foreign policy, defense issues, but also taxation. This is, of course, not going to happen. Because, so what we have to admit and what we have to live with is that there will be still a very imperfect institutional structure and institutional architecture of the European Union, with some very serious democratic shortcomings from the democratic point of view, which probably will not be neither easily nor very soon repaired. And the only thing, or the maximum we can achieve now, is to change the atmosphere in the European Parliament, slowly, gradually, step by step, elections by elections, in order to make it less ambitious, more relevant for everyday lives of citizens of individual European member countries of the EU, and more listening to their everyday needs and wishes, and less willing to pursue certain ideology, for instance, in particular, the green one, which in recent years, and most particularly since 2019, has penetrated agendas of almost all political forces in the European Parliament. Hopefully this will change after these elections, because it seems, according to the polls, that the Green Group in the European Parliament will be the biggest loser. They will lose some 25% or even more of their current MEPs. So they will just fall down in that power ladder of EP political groupings, and that, in my feeling, might have only a that impact that they will not be able to influence that much, particularly economic agenda and regulatory framework of the European Union. But again, no revolutionary change in the European Parliament can be expected, just evolutionary step by step. We have to be patient.
Oh, thank you. Let me try to distill some of the main points you have made, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So you predict that, based on the polls, that the Green Bloc, which consists of different factions but agrees on revolutionary green renovation of Europe, that this Green Bloc is bound to lose, and they're the biggest losers. Then the second main issue is we have on the right three main factions. We have the EPP. If you put it on party level, you have EPP, ECR, and ID. And then, as you mentioned, your own ECR is very heterogeneous and has a lot of internal ideological diversity. So this very diverse, complex right-wing landscape in the European Parliament has, however, a major rift in it. It's particularly hard for the German-centric Christian Democratic EPP to cooperate with national conservative and perhaps populist sentiments and movements. And then the final point you've made is that the European Parliament, even though it represents, of course, it has all these representatives from all these different countries and all these different parties in Europe, even though it has this representative aspect, it also has its own ideological leaning. And like other institutions in Brussels, it has a strong federalist bias. However, do you believe, maybe that's a good question, do you believe that the outcome of the 2024 elections, let's say the National Conservatives and populists will win big on a platform that's critical towards the green agenda, or this like very hyper ideological green agenda, and critical on mass migration? Do you believe that if this occurs, that the Federalist project that has a diffused presence in European institutions will be seriously hampered?
I don't know whether seriously, but definitely it will be weakened if that happens, if that development happens. I think that even the most federalist forces within, for instance, the EPP, and by the way, another reason why EPP traditionally makes alliance with the second largest group, which always used to be the socialist group, the SD, is also the redistribution of power within the structures of the European Parliament. Because if two biggest guys make an alliance, then redistribution of power within the institution of the European Parliament is much easier for them, because redistributions of all functions, including the European Parliament presidency and vice presidency, chairmanship of all, vice chairmanship of all committees, chairmanship and vice chairmanship of all delegations, is done according so-called DONT formula, which gives to the strongest one the most advantage in obtaining or grabbing the most powerful functions within the European Parliament. Let's not forget about that. So this is also a power game within the institution. But back to your question, I think that the federalist tendencies will not disappear, because unfortunately they are deeply rooted in some very principles of some particular political parties, but definitely they might be weakened. And some political parties might start to think twice whether they should not somehow modify their own very principles if they see that representatives of some other forces, be it so-called Eurosceptics or so-called populists or whoever, are suddenly cannibalizing on their own electorates and are getting their agendas that they were not able to pursue. That might lead to some second thoughts about the whole concept of federal Europe. Again, this is not going to happen from one day to another, neither from 1 year to another. This will be a long evolutionary way. But I think that results of 2024 elections might be, under some circumstances, the beginning of such a way.
Thank you. Let's turn to Carlos Roa, with our visiting fellow, with some comments.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mr. Zahradil. I'm kind of tickled you mentioned Mount Albright, since she taught me at Georgetown. Not necessarily agree with my views, but that's in the past. Unfortunately, I am an ignorant American. I don't know much about the EU parliamentary system. For me, our own Congress is already difficult to understand. I feel like you need a PhD to understand EU politics. So, bravo, you probably know way more than any of us. But I am, I want to say somewhat cognizant of trends, and this is what, to me, is problematic. Let's say immigration. Now, I'm a son of immigrants. I want to think I am very sympathetic in these views, but as an American, I hear, stories of, let's say, recently in Brussels, we had, for the past, today's the 27th, so the past 3 days, we've had battles between ethnic Kurdish and Turkish immigrants. Over here, other incidents, I get concerned. Now, this isn't a solely European problem. We have increasingly in the United States more problems and incidents with illegal immigration. We had a recent standoff between the governor of Texas and the Biden administration. And these problems, as Nathan earlier indicated, are held up because bureaucracies, nonprofits, and all these other, let's say, factors prevent the problem from being resolved. And we're told usually but we need immigrants in order to help the economy. All right, let's go along with that logic just for a bit. The economy right now throughout the West is in need of help. Inflation is pretty high, and this will require raising interest rates. Okay, but that's not something politicians can directly affect. That requires a bit more pressure from the central bank. And if we were to raise interest rates, we start seeing banks, starting to fail or in difficult financial situation. I don't know how it is in Europe, but recent reports say in the United States, if we raise interest rates too high, around a third of regional banks are at risk of failing, and that'd be pretty bad. Even if we put aside the inflation, more broad economy-wise, we have problems restoring productivity because of higher energy prices or other factors. In Europe, high energy prices means now that Germany is deindustrializing. We have various issues. I think the article in Politico was Rust Belt on the Rhine. In the United States, we can't start new energy projects because we have this various ESG rules, etc., which are not a government-mandated thing. They're usually a private sector thing. So what does all have in common? We're all being subjected to, in both sides of the Atlantic, to structural issues or trend issues, which even if we have a very strong right-wing political result in this election or even in future elections, these aren't problems that can't be addressed directly or resolved overnight. So can some of these problems be resolved even if we have right-wing successes in the near future or even in the medium, longer term?
Well, I think that what we have seen on both sides of Atlantic, in EU and in the US as well, and particularly during or after COVID, which somehow strengthened those tendencies, was less willingness for opening markets and more tendencies to protect domestic markets. There has been an idea, and that was most particularly popular in Central and Eastern European countries in the 90s, my country, others probably as well, that we should try to create a very wide transatlantic, fully open economic area with not 100%, but very near to 100% free flow of goods and services and capital and everything, so free trade area, I think that we are, despite the fact that the trade volume between US and Europe is still very high, we are rather departing from that very idea that was popular in 90s. You can see that we have never managed to make this new transatlantic trade deal that was frozen a couple of years ago, never revived. Mostly it collapsed on a disagreement on the trade with agricultural products. Then you had very recently, under the Biden administration, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which in fact is not about that much reducing inflation, but rather about giving US enterprises certain comparative advantages in compare with their European competitors. So it could be considered kind of protectionist measure as well. When it comes to our vulnerability to external shocks that later on are creating inflation or economic instability, we are not fully masters of our own destiny. If you look, well, maybe US, they are much better, because when it comes to energy security, you are doing much better off than Europe. We were really severely hit, and Central and Eastern Europe in particular, by the war in Ukraine and by the feeling that it's necessary for us to get rid of an unreliable supplier of energy sources and to replace that one with some other ones. And that, of course, started or triggered also to some extent inflation spiral, which fortunately now seems to go down the road, but it's been during last 2 or 3 years, it's been really very high. And my country, for instance, we have experienced a year ago or 2 years ago, we experienced inflation 18%, which was, now we are down to 2% again, fortunately, but 18%, this is something we have never ever experienced since 30 years. Probably only after liberalization of prices in 1992, we hit that, but even that time, it was not 18%. So we are externally vulnerable to understand the situation in the multipolar world, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. We have to admit that other political powers are now not shy to use their instruments in order to influence the global economic environment. And we have to count with that, and we have to find some new balance, some new status quo, some new modus with them, and not to wage some new trade wars and restrictions that would, of course, retaliate and would have a negative impact at the end on us. You also mentioned at the beginning, I don't know whether I understood correctly, that remark on migration at the very beginning. I think that US, by the way, is the country with the best geography in the world, because you have no, with slight exception, the southbound, which I think could be still sorted out relatively easily if there's a political will. You have no direct migration challenge, unlike Europe. We are challenged from many angles, from the south, from the southeast, and from the east now. And the stabilizing factor on European societies is nowadays visible, measurable, and I think that sooner or later it has to be targeted. What else was there? Maybe economic environment per se. Yeah, it's a well-known fact. Over-regulation, a lot of red tape, some Green Deal preconditions are squeezing the European economy, European entrepreneur, European enterprises and European businesses. If at least one result of that new shift or expected shift in the European Parliament after the elections will be that this new European Parliament will be less ideologically driven when it comes to Green Deal and more reasonable, more business-friendly, more entrepreneurship-friendly, I would be satisfied. I don't expect much. I expect some changes, not revolutionary, as I said before, but if in the field of economy, if it's more reasonable, more rational, more business-friendly, I think it's likely I would be satisfied.
Well, that's good to hear that you do have some hope of a slightly more business-friendly approach coming to the European Parliament. But of course, at the same time, you're worried about the trends that we have seen in recent years towards more protectionism and red tape. Now, ironically, the Western world and the larger transatlantic realm have become more fractured by all these protectionist measures on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, we are following similar trends in that regard, and in that sense, ideologically coming more together. So there's still this negative commonality, so to speak, and with that, I would like to turn to our final respondent, Lana Starkey, and I just wanted to say this is of course. It is, of course, exactly because we have such shared common ideological trends on both sides of the Atlantic and in Europe and in the larger Western and Anglo-sphere realm that the Danube Institute makes so much sense. Because if the Anglo-sphere and would have ideological trends that would diverge completely from the ideological trends in Hungary and Central Europe and continental Europe, then the mission of the Danube Institute, which is to bridge Hungarian and continental European and Central European politics on the one hand and the wider Anglosphere on the other hand, wouldn't make much sense. So luckily we still have this mission because the Western world is still following the same trends, whether these trends are good or bad. So Lana, to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Coming from Australia, this is a bit different for me, but again, the trends are similar. I'm particularly interested in populism, and I suppose this rift or these three center right and then further right factions that you have. My understanding of populism is that it threatens the stability of democracies because it's part of a sort of wider failure to appreciate the virtue and necessity of representation. So I see this as a crisis of political representation. And so I suppose that this would be different for each nation, for each country. And I'm interested in my question is sort of, how can somebody like Meloni, for example, who was elected on an anti-migration sort of platform, she's now, I saw in the news today, she's being criticized for supporting the Ursula von der Leyen. She's criticized by, of course, the ADF and the far right in France. And there's a quote from her from this week saying that the important thing is to achieve a centre-right majority, even at the cost of a possible compromise with Ursula von der Leyen. So how does that work in terms of political representation, how, this is a larger question, populist movements, they if they were to get into power, they can't really run things. They're not very good at governing. So although, but at the same time, the more conservatives as traditionally understood, the ones who can govern, do need to deal with these populist problems, migration, immigration, economic problems that are very emotional and very, almost like a mob mentality. So I see this as, I don't know, I'm just speaking generally as a problem that seems even more complicated in Europe than maybe in Australia or the UK with, say, Brexit. And then maybe just, this is a bit of a side question, is that you talked a lot about transatlanticism, of course, this is the whole point. But what was the impact of Brexit on the ECR in particular? On the ECR, Brexit. So you didn't have the support, or you don't have the support anymore. So how has the ECR rebuilt after that? And is there a big gap? What are you doing to address, I suppose, this situation after Brexit? And what are your, if you have any thoughts of the relationship between Europe and the UK as well after Brexit?
Thank you. I will start with Brexit. The original ECR was very much built on a goodwill or attempt of UK Conservative Party to leave the EPP, which was one of the promises under which David Cameron was elected the party leader in 2005, after the third, I think, or the fourth electoral defeat by Labour under Tony Blair. So then Cameron came with his own agenda, and he promised that if elected, he would lead Conservatives from the EPP, which he eventually did. It was not an easy thing, by the way, because to create a new group in the European Parliament, you need not only numbers in, I think, numbers of MEPs, but also number of nationalities. And this is at least, I think now it's at least eight nationalities you need to create a new group. So at the beginning, we were just three. British Conservative Party, my Czech party, ODS, and Polish Law and Justice. Then, after a few years of a very intensive work, we managed to get there, to get the eight. Of course, sometimes just by one person from, I don't know, Greece or Netherlands or and so on. But we did it. So since 2009, we launched the ECR. At the very beginning, immediately after we did that, we appeared under a very severe wave of attacks from the mainstream, particularly from the EPP. We were portrayed like extremist, populist, xenophobe, racist, whatever you can imagine, it was there. Miraculously, well, not that miraculously, situation changed in 2010 when the Conservative Party won the elections and made Cameron Prime Minister. Suddenly, everybody became very nice to us, because suddenly they recognized that we are serious story, that we can produce prime ministers, that we can be, in power, and they needed to make deals with UK government and the Council of the European Union. So suddenly they started to be, well, I wouldn't say nice, but at least tolerable. They have shown much more tolerance. That again changed in 2016 after the Brexit referendum, after they recognized, the European mainstream recognized that it was serious, that it is going to happen, that the result will not be reversed, and that sooner or later, in the range of a few years, the United Kingdom is going to leave. Immediately after 6 years of relatively nice cohabitation, they once again became very nasty because they suddenly understand, they started to understand that UK is out, so they do not need to care about any future UK Conservative Prime Minister from the European point of view. So again, we have gone through a very complicated years. And then once again, they started to be nice after Giorgia Meloni won the elections, because once again they recognized that we can produce prime minister in a big country, in the third largest European economy. So making the long story short, Brexit definitely had an impact on us. For some time, very short time, it looked even that this will be a crucial question of our survival, and it was even uncertain whether we would have survived or not. Finally, we managed to somehow muddle through all those difficulties. Now we are back on track, but of course the change of our political profile is visible. We became much more, let's say, socially conservative, much more in line with that new national conservative set of principles than ever before, because looking back at David Cameron governments, they were relatively liberal in social issues, but also in economic issues. So this is not the case anymore. And speaking frankly, what was the most surprising thing for me was how quickly the urgency of EU-UK relations somehow disappeared or evaporated once they left, which was January 2020. So it's not that UK would be completely irrelevant, no. But the urgency, the importance of that particular relation is much lesser than any time before. Suddenly, maybe Ukraine, Ukraine played this whole thing a little bit back because we need, security and defense cooperation, all that stuff. But basically, I think that with the exception of very complicated and very specific issue of borders with Northern Ireland, which was the most complicated trade negotiation ever between de facto it was the only one, because this is the only territorial border between EU and UK, between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So a part of this complicated issue, which was really negotiated from all sides to most details, suddenly the urgency of our relations somehow visibly diminished. Now, on the question of populism, I think that this label is it's being misused. I think that you can label, but if you wish, if you are a member of mainstream, you can now use this label endlessly. You can label anyone as being populist. This is populist, that is populist. And sometimes as populists are labeled those who simply are not shy to address some very painful problems of contemporary Europe, be it migration or other things. They are being harshly attacked from the liberal left, and the label of populism or being populist is widely misused. Of course, when those parties that are being or having been labeled as populist suddenly arrive to power, sometimes they change, but this is usually under external pressure. Good example is Meloni, who suddenly started to understand that she needs to cooperate somehow with other European countries because she cannot sort the migration problem just herself, just as Italy alone, but some network, some cooperation is needed. And of course, other countries in the Council of the EU have used their leverage in order to modify the radical Italian position which was there at the beginning. So I understand that there is even some criticism growing from some Italian political forces, mostly from Mr. Salvini in particular. On the other hand, if you look at Brothers of Italy in polls, they are still the same. They won the elections with 25%. Now they are polling in 30%, and they are still there for more than 1 year, which is almost miracle on Italian political scene. So it seems that it has the impact of that, let's say, changed rhetorics. It's not that profound. It's not that dramatic that it would change the political preferences of particularly Italian electorate.
This is very helpful for understanding the relationship between populism and national conservatism, which is also one of the big questions that we struggle with here, also at the Danube Institute. Nathan, did you wanted to reply to that?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that we've sort of stumbled in our conversation on what I think is the big question for the right in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, which is this idea, as Lana mentioned, this problem of representation, where when, let's say populist, I agree that's not a good word, but a populist party comes into power, like in Meloni's case, with a mandate from the people to take drastic action to solve the problems that they are concerned about, such as migration. What we repeatedly see is that this does not happen. And in Meloni's case, she has essentially failed for whatever reasons to take decisive action on migration and instead sort of pushed it up to the European level. But do you think that there's a real issue if this keeps happening with other parties, that essentially the right-wing parties around Europe will run into the same issue as, say, the Tories, the Conservative Party in Britain, where effectively they're going to be, it looks like, wiped out because they have failed to meet any of the demands that from the people who vote for them, which they also had a mandate to take decisive action on. You've mentioned that there'll be no revolutionary change in the European Parliament, but it seems like now is the time when people around Europe are demanding, if not revolutionary, then at least radical change. Is there a reason that, what is keeping the parties of Europe from taking much more drastic action than they have in the past?
European architecture, that power triangle, which is Commission, Council, and Parliament, is composed in a way that effectively prevents any revolutionary change. Because when you have this triangle, always you will have at least one institution that will be more or less perpetuous. And that will stick with the status quo. So even if the European Parliament changed, it doesn't mean that the other two will change as well, or the Council of the European Union. My feeling is that the institution which is probably which could be the most dynamic one in pursuing changes could never be a pan-European institution, but only a national institution. So if you have changes in few more European governments, if you have few more national conservative prime ministers entering the regular meetings of the Council of the European Union that will get together, that will show up, that will show some strength, some determination, and some grip in some particular issue, then it could easily change the atmosphere. I can tell you that sometimes in the Council of the EU, at these annual meetings, it is very simple that everybody sits silent, and then one prime minister comes up with some issue which he or she believes is important, and with some strong opinion or strong statement, and suddenly others will start to join. Yeah, there's something on that. Yeah. I will second this. Yeah, that's not bad. Let's talk about it. So suddenly it needs just one trigger, someone who is courageous enough to start that, and then the snowball effect comes second. Unlike in the European Parliament, unfortunately, because it is too complex, it is too stuck in these old power games, or power redistribution games. So I think that until there is no visible or strong or measurable majority of a different political opinion, and this is not going to happen after these elections, no way, then there won't be any change coming up from within the European Parliament. There might be change of atmosphere, there might be change of mood, there might be change of rhetorics, but this is not enough to make a real change of the real things from within the European Parliament.
We have a few minutes left to turn to the questions by the audience. I see that our president John has a first question over there. So you're eager with your question, John, for quite some time.
Yes. Thank you. I see obviously your argument, because if you have a Rubik's cube problem, then actually solving it is not going to be done in a single step. But let us examine, would you examine the problem this way? You have mentioned the way in which changes in national politics can directly influence the changes in European parliamentary politics. But in addition to that, in other words, the appointment of new commissioners, a different kind of commissioners, and the changes of party alliances in national coalitions. But what about another case? I think in both Britain and America, you're going to see after these elections, whatever their results, a movement towards uniting the right. That is to say, the right in both Britain and America is at the moment very divided, and it's creating problems for the parties, very serious ones. But whether or not they win, and particularly if they win, there's going to be a movement towards a more unified Republican Party and towards a more unified Tory Party. Unless, of course, the Tories actually find themselves outnumbered by reform, which I don't think likely. In those circumstances, I don't think it's difficult to see ways in which let us say, the Trump and Reagan wings of the party form a new, unified, agreed set of programs. In fact, the other day, the man who was Director of Policy Planning in the State Department reviewed favorably an article about a new book about how the foreign policies of Reagan and Trump could merge in a way that reflected the new reality of Republican politics. In those circumstances, won't that exercise, and it's also happening in European politics in some countries like Italy and Holland, you get the impression, I think, that the movement towards more unified conservatism would have an attraction on European parliamentary politics as well, in the same way as the moon influences the tides. that in general politics would be looking at ideas of uniting the right in the circumstances of successful parties of the right.
That's I don't know really. I think there's a lot of variables, a lot of diverse national interests still in the EU. Only if you look at this this Ukrainian issue, then formally there is a set of unified or united resolutions coming from the Council or the Parliament or from elsewhere. But if you look at the level of mental engagement, then definitely it's much more intensive and much higher in Central and Eastern Europe than, for instance, in Spain or Portugal or some other countries. So I think that the UK and US are definitely a different story because they are homogeneous societies. They are nation states which European Union is not on the European level, and that's the main obstacle in finding some ways to realignment of whatever of the right which we talk here, but I'm not saying that this is impossible, but it takes much more time, energy, and effort than in homogeneous nation state or political scene in a homogeneous nation state like UK and US. And by the way, I'm very curious what's going to happen in the United Kingdom after probably this year's or early next year's general elections, because if the Conservative Party suffers a maybe, I don't know, unprecedented defeat in history, for me, it's a big question mark. What then would be a response of the party to that development, to that sort of humiliation, whether they will be tending to move more towards the center or to getting more radical to the right, where, how is it called, the Reform Party is once again is starting to be outspoken. I don't know. But I think that in UK it's much less predictable than, for instance, in US, where I can see one it's not 100% still within the GOP, within the Republican Party, but definitely it's a majority stream. And if they do well in presidential and congressional elections, that stream will embrace and will take over the Republican Party as a whole. That's my feeling.
We have time for one last question, and I saw hands going up all over the different places in the audience, but could we turn to the gentleman with the red tie, and please state your name and affiliation, please.
Dobrý večer, good evening. I'm Dénes András Nagy from the Center for Fundamental Rights, who organize CPAC Hungary, which you kindly mentioned at the beginning of your speech. My question concerns the realignment within the European Parliament. For that to happen, the ECR party needs to become, hopefully, the third largest force in the European Parliament. For that to happen, more political parties need to join the ECR. In Hungary, there is no ECR member party, but there is a party that is a candidate for ECR membership, Fidesz. What are your thoughts on Fidesz joining the ECR?
Now, let me make distinction between my personal opinion and, let's say, the institutional opinion of not only mine, but other political parties. If it was on me, just my personal decision, I would accept Fidesz tomorrow. But I'm not saying that this is the opinion of my Czech political party as well. and other political parties from Central and Eastern Europe as well, because some of them have serious problems and serious concerns about disagreement in this Ukrainian issue, and so on and so on. At the end, I believe that when it comes to the issue, and that there's a precedent for that, it happened several times in the past, there will be a secret ballot whether to admit Fidesz to ECR or not. If that secret ballot gets a positive result in favor of Fidesz being member of the ECR, those parties who voted against either have to adjust themselves to that new situation, or if they not be willing to do so, they will probably consider changing their affiliation and leaving for the other group. For my party, I would strongly advise them against any thoughts about leaving the ECR, because we were founding fathers of that group, so I see absolutely no reason why we should even consider leaving. But if theoretically that happened, and I don't believe that if that happens, but if that happened, I'm sure that sooner or later there will be another Czech representation within the ECR as well. Anyway, I think that we had a precedent for that, if I may recall that. In 2014, in the second term of the ECR, there were, I think, 7 or 8 or even 9 MEPs from AfD, from German AfD. At that time, it was a somehow different AfD than it is now. It was an AfD which was run by, as we call it, professors, Starbati and Henkel and Bernd Lucke. So it was less kind of, let's say, less radical than it is now. But still, some parties had a problem with that. And they applied for the ECR. And British Conservative Party said, no, we don't want to have AfD in the ECR. And we said, okay, so let's have a vote. So we had a secret ballot, and AfD was admitted to join. So what the Conservative Party would do? They, took some time for second thoughts and decisions, and then they came back and said, okay, we stay. So that's it. There's a precedent for that.
Well, we've regretfully run out of time, but please give a round of applause for our three respondents and, of course, Mr. Zahradil.